For our next keynote, Ajit Pai, Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, FCC USA.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning. It is always great to be with the IIC. By my counts, this is my 9th time speaking at an IIC event. One more stamp and I get a free sandwich. I actually spoke at this very same event at the end of my first year as chairman. My love of nostalgia is not just limited to the 1980s, so I thought it would be interesting to see what I said to this audience during year 1 of my chairmanship. In a nutshell, I said that my primary goal as FCC chairman was going to be extending digital opportunity to all Americans. I also stressed my commitment to unlocking the possibilities of next generation wireless networks, what we all know as 5G. These themes are likely familiar to you since I talked about them constantly during years 2, 3, and 4 of my chairmanship as well. And to achieve these goals, I said the Commission was going to focus on reducing barriers to infrastructure deployment and repurposing spectrum for advanced wireless services. Well, while the agency's priorities have stayed consistent over the past 4 years, the list that all we have done in their pursuit has grown tremendously. Across the board, the FCC has been working hard to modernize its regulations and to clear unnecessary roadblocks to infrastructure investment. For example, to promote the deployment of wireless wired infrastructure like fiber, the FCC has made it easier and cheaper for broadband providers to access utility poles, a critical input into building a broadband network. To make it easier to install wireless infrastructure, like small cells, we set a reasonable deadline for cities to rule on siting applications. And we also set reasonable limits on siting fees that allow municipalities to recover their costs. We've also made it easier for companies to transition away from the fading copper infrastructure of yesterday toward the fiber infrastructure of tomorrow. We recognize that every dollar that is spent propping up copper, by definition, cannot be spent on fiber. And yes, 1 week after my 2017 speech, the FCC voted to scrap rules developed in the 1930s to heavily regulate the internet like a slow-moving utility. Now, to somebody who doesn't spend their time watching IIC webinars, this could all sound deathly boring, I will concede. But the results most certainly are not. Millions more Americans have access to the internet today than in 2016. In 2018, and then again in 2019, we set records in the United States for fiber deployment. The number of small cells in the United States has skyrocketed. During 2018 and 2019, more than 72,000 new wireless cell sites were located in the United States, a 10 times increase over the number deployed from 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016 combined. Average download speeds for fixed broadband in the United States has more than doubled since 2017. The number of Americans enjoying more than 2 options for standard terrestrial fixed broadband has increased by 52%. And compared to 2015, today's average US consumer is paying 28% less for broadband in real terms while enjoying faster speeds. Now, while removing barriers to broadband build-out is an essential step toward closing the digital divide, it's not the only one. For those rural, high-cost, low-population areas where the economic incentives for private standalone investment just don't exist, the FCC has partnered with private companies in order to connect places where the economics wouldn't work without our help. Our newest initiative, and biggest so far, to close the digital divide is our Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction. The $20 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund will connect millions of unserved homes and businesses in the United States in our hardest to serve communities through a 2-phase reverse auction that encourages the deployment of the best performing networks for the lowest cost possible. In fact, just yesterday, we released the results of the successful Phase 1 auction of the RDOF, as it's called. 180 different bidders won more than $9.2 billion in support over the next 10 years to deploy broadband networks to an estimated 10.1 million Americans who are currently on the wrong side of the digital divide. More than 98% of the homes and businesses eligible for support in the auction received a winning bid. More than 85% of them will be getting gigabit speed service, and nearly all of the rest will have access to broadband with at least 100 megabit per second download speed. And moreover, the vigorous competition among the more than 300 bidders that competed in the reverse auction substantially drove down the cost of serving those areas. And because of this competition, including technologically neutral competitors from a variety of sectors, we didn't spend all of our $16 billion budget for the Phase 1 auction. And the $6.8 billion that we saved will be available for our Phase 2 auction, which will target funding to deploy broadband to Americans living in areas where some, but not all, homes have broadband access. Indeed, our budget for the Phase 2 auction has now gone up by $6.8 billion, from $4.4 billion to $11.2 billion, due to the results of the Phase 1 auction. If you go to the FCC's website at fcc.gov, you can check out a list of people and places who will no longer be bypassed by the digital revolution. Now, the FCC is also going big to promote the deployment of next-generation wireless networks in rural America. This past October, we voted to establish the 5G Fund for rural America. And this new program will use a two-phase, multi-round reverse auction to rural areas of our country in order to distribute up to $9 billion for 5G-capable networks in places that are unlikely to see 5G service without federal support. Now again, promoting 5G deployment is one of the goals identified in my 2017 speech to the IAC. I also promised that we are going to move aggressively to free up spectrum for 5G and other services. And that is exactly what we have done. We've made spectrum available through 3 auctions. In fact, more high-band spectrum that's been used for commercial use than previously was used for terrestrial mobile broadband by all wireless service providers in the United States combined. We finished repurposing low-band spectrum in the 600 megahertz band for mobile broadband. And that spectrum is now being used to provide 5G service coverage to areas where more than 250 million Americans live. And we've also made a lot of progress on mid-band spectrum, which is appealing for 5G because it combines good geographic coverage with strong capacity. This past August, the FCC successfully completed an auction of 70 megahertz of licensed spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band, our first ever auction of mid-band spectrum for 5G. And we've completed the necessary technical work so that the entire 150 megahertz of the band can now be used by the private sector. Indeed, some companies are already starting to experiment with innovative solutions like private LTE networks based on this very spectrum. Now, the Commission's biggest auction of mid-band spectrum for 5G is actually kicking off today in a couple of hours. It involves the 280 megahertz of spectrum from 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz, commonly called the C-band. This past February, the FCC voted to clear the lower 300 megahertz of the C-band and make 280 megahertz of it available for 5G through a public auction, plus the 20 megahertz guard band. Now, the FCC also adopted flexible rules for the 2.5 gigahertz band. We've also approved a plan that has us on track to auction 100 megahertz of contiguous mid-band spectrum in the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band next year. So add all of these efforts up, and we are on a path to have a contiguous 530 megahertz swath from 3.45 to 3.98 gigahertz of mid-band spectrum available for 5G, plus that 2.5 gigahertz band I just mentioned. And all of this is just on the licensed side of the ledger. We've also taken landmark steps to make available unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi. Just last month, the FCC voted to permit unlicensed operations in the lower 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band, spectrum which had been largely unused for the past 2 decades. And this past April, the FCC voted to make the entire 6 gigahertz band available for unlicensed use. By doing this, we created a massive 1200 megahertz testbed for innovators and innovation. This is a big deal. We've effectively increased the amount of mid-band spectrum available for Wi-Fi by a factor of 5. And just yesterday, our Office of Engineering and Technology authorized the first 6 gigahertz device for use in the United States. So the band's promise is beginning to become a reality. And in the future, I would expect both licensed and unlicensed spectrum that we've freed up to be powerful complements in delivering advanced wireless services to the American people. Now, I've spoken today about what we've been doing in the US to free up more spectrum for new wireless services. Now, the reality is that these efforts to make more spectrum available will have an even greater impact if we can create more opportunities for harmonization. Now, this group has been particularly helpful in bringing people together to build international consensus around opportunities for spectrum harmonization and in advance of meetings like WRC 19. And so, when it comes to outlining a strategy for what the next few years will look like and executing on that strategy, I'm relieved to say that my 2017 remarks hold up rather well. And I want to thank the IIC for being a partner during this journey. I joked early on that I've attended so many IIC events that it's hard to keep count. But I keep coming back because the challenges that we face are global challenges. And the IIC has been a leader in bringing regulators and industry from around the world together to focus on key ICT topics. It is one of the precious few fora where one can listen thoughtfully and learn deeply. And for that, I'm grateful. In closing, as you may know, I will be leaving the FCC on January 20th of 2021. And I want you to know that it has been a privilege to get to know you as colleagues and to count you as friends. And as I exit the stage, I am, of course, grateful for our friendship, and I'm reassured knowing that the IIC will continue to work with the FCC and others around the globe to promote digital opportunity for all. Thank you for the many years of friendship and for giving me a chance to share my views this morning, and Godspeed to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Pai, and apologies for the glitch at the beginning. I was experiencing a bit of digital exclusion. But first, because I wasn't able to say this at the beginning, on behalf of the IIC, I want to thank you for the rich contributions that you've made to the IIC since I think your first foray in Mexico with the IIC in one of the first TMFs for the Miami conference. So thank you very much, and we wish you Godspeed in what's your next new thing. And before we start to get a lot of questions on this subject, maybe I could ask you what your crystal ball holds, if you have anything that you can share with us at this point.
The only thing I can share is that on January 21st, I intend to sleep in for a good long while and then enjoy another big cup of coffee. But one of the things I've found throughout my career is that if I focus on doing my very best in whatever position I'm in, the future will tend to take care for itself. And so I have faith that with the support of my family and friends and those of you who have had the chance to work with, something will pop up that will be a promising new adventure. So stay tuned.
That's great. Well, I'm sure it'll be very exciting, whatever it is. And again, we really do appreciate your participation, and we hope to see you again in your next new position.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm waiting for Ed to join us, and I'm wondering if he is in the. I see something green is happening here, so let's give it a second.
If you can't see me, can you hear me, Ann?
Yes, we can hear you, Ed.
Okay. I'm not sure the practice session worked and my video showed up, but we'll see if it pops up here.
Okay, maybe you didn't wear the right color sweater, Ed.
Not bright red today.
All right. Well, I threw out a question to the chairman, and let me throw out one to you, or to both of you, really. I mean, I think the pandemic has sort of taught us a lot about ourselves and about how we can make use of all of the wonderful technologies that are available to us, but it's also exposed some soft spots. Maybe that's putting it mildly. I wonder if maybe both of you could talk a little bit about what I mean, I don't think anything good has come out of the pandemic, but at least what learnings have we got from it that perhaps we can build on for the future. Let me start with you. Go ahead, Chairman Pai.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. So I think, number one, it has underscored the critical importance of broadband in all of our lives. In March, once we realized that hundreds of millions of Americans would be moving to a work-from-home, stay-at-home environment, I quickly realized that broadband would be essential. And that's why we initiated what we call the Keep Americans Connected Pledge, a challenge to broadband providers not to cut off service for any consumer who was unable to pay a bill, to waive late fees, and to open up Wi-Fi hotspots. And that was enormously successful, with 800 providers stepping up to the plate. But we've also redoubled our efforts on things like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that I mentioned in my own remarks to ensure that public investment goes towards targeting those unserved parts of the country. We've also amped up our ability to give spectrum on a temporary basis to companies to increase the bandwidth that they're able to deliver and to extend the access. And I think that's the kind of thing that's going to be critical in the future. I certainly think that regardless of country or even agency, it's going to be critical for us to have more public-private partnerships to make sure that digital divide is closed. And you mentioned some of the silver linings out of the pandemic. I think that one of the biggest ones is the power of telehealth, that now with remote care, with a high-speed broadband connection, you're able to access quality healthcare and get better outcomes than you would have previously. And that's a necessity during the pandemic. And I hope once we emerge from the pandemic, greater emphasis on telehealth, breaking down those barriers from broadband access to interstate medical licensure will become much more of the norm rather than the exception.
And I'll add to what the chairman said, Ann, and I take it you can hear me but not see me. It may be the best of both worlds. I have a face for radio, but the chairman's exactly right in terms of this pandemic has just really laid bare what we've all known. There is a digital divide. And the fact is, if you're on the wrong side of that divide, you're at risk of being left behind. And that became clear when we saw people being able to work remotely, which helped mitigate the impact of the pandemic, the economic impact, so many people being able to connect to their work, people being able to distance learn and connect to their teachers, students, and people, frankly, just being able to, fill a social gap and be able to see their families and friends. But that wasn't true for everyone. And the fact is, we need to foster policies that bridge that divide. I want to say to my friend Chairman Pai, thank you on behalf of all Americans for your service and what you've done to do that in your very consequential and impactful chairmanship for the reasons, many of the things you talked about here. For example, a light touch regulatory approach is critically important to fostering the benefits of the private investment we have seen, but we need more of that investment. And so we at AT&T are working very hard to advocate for policies that will incentivize private investment with government subsidy and the kind of approach that Ajit has taken at the FCC to get people who don't have access at all. There's no switch to flip. There's no infrastructure to connect to incentivize investment in those largely rural communities. But there are also people who do have access to the internet but cannot afford it. And we need to make it more affordable as well for low-income households to get people connected. And in order to do that, we're going to have sustainable funding mechanisms in place in terms of government policy. And the mechanisms that we have right now are antiquated, and they need to be reformed and modernized. And so from our perspective, we think it's critically important to close this digital divide by providing for access and affordability and sustainable funding mechanisms in order to ensure that. And I would just echo what Ajit said relative to, I think one of the things we're seeing is the opportunities that have also been exposed in this time of challenge. And telehealth, I think, is one of the greatest opportunities going forward. And if we can do the things that we need to do relative to getting a 5G network in place everywhere, without the latency and some of the other problems that we have in the antiquated networks that Ajit mentioned as well, people will be able to be diagnosed and to visit with their doctors remotely, and you will also have the capacity to upload some significant files like MRI files and things like that. The data demands can be met. So I'm optimistic. But we have a lot of challenges, and the pandemic has laid those bare over the past 8 months or so.
Let me just make sure that the audience is aware that they can ask questions. The instructions, I think, should be on your screen. So please do send your questions if you have any. But let me follow up then with another question, maybe a bit more concrete, and maybe Chairman Pai, thinking ahead to your new roles, down the road roller roles, and not as chairman of the FCC right now. I was reading one of Ed's articles that he'd written, and I was not aware that in the U.S., although I should be aware because I should look at my bills now that I'm back here, that it's around 27% that we pay in taxes on on telecom services and so forth already. So as a funding mechanism, I would think it's going to be quite hard to talking about how are we going to fund this build out. I think it'd be quite hard to add to the taxes that we already see that are specific to the telecom sector. What other options are there that you see down the road for over the next 4 years?
Yeah, that's a critical issue. So that essentially forms the funding base for what we call our Universal Service Fund, which enables us to do things like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or the 5G Fund for Rural America. And Ed is correct that over time, that base has shrunk as people migrate to other technologies. And so the question has arisen, well, how do we make sure that that funding base is sustainable? One of the proposals that's been floated is essentially taxing broadband as opposed to voice service. And that's something that many have spoken out firmly against in the past, that would essentially operate as a regressive tax on consumers, especially those who are least able to afford it, and only increases the affordability gap for broadband services. Another mechanism for solving this problem has recently been advanced by Ed and AT&T, which is direct funding from Congress. So as opposed to the tax going into a pot that the FCC distributes, there would be a direct appropriation from Congress. That's another solution that has been discussed. There may be other different ways to thread that needle as well. And so I think one of the things that lawmakers and regulators will have to talk about is what is the right mechanism going forward? So I think we've all identified clearly the need for universal service when it comes to advanced technologies. How to fund it is going to be an ongoing conversation, and it won't be an easy one.
Ed, any thoughts on that, or did you want to expand a little on the proposals that you guys have already put forward?
Well, Ajit's exactly right. Our view is, and of course, expanding the base would help to lower the rate. One of the reasons that the rate is as high as it is because, to the chairman's point, the base has been shrinking. If you're taxing basic telephone service and fewer people are, reliant on that, you end up with a higher rate in order to try to fund the programs. And that's a death spiral over time. It's unsustainable. You could broaden the base and tax broadband. You could broaden the base further and try to impose a tax on platforms and those who use and benefit from that broadband as well. That would be a challenge, I think, in terms of implementing as a policy, but those are valid ideas, understanding that the current system is unsustainable. From our perspective, as you look at it, what we've seen is, clearly access to broadband and internet connectivity is something that's critically important to households today for the reasons that we've discussed here. And therefore, if that's the case, then our view is it should be treated like housing or food. And housing and food in the US and in many other countries are subsidized for those who cannot afford it. In the US, they're subsidized by direct appropriation. And we also think that the USF program, the Universal Service Fund that Ajit mentioned, should be modernized to look more like in the way our food stamp program, which is a food subsidy for low-income households, was modernized a couple decades ago, to what's called the SNAP program, where households and families get a debit card essentially, and they're able to shop and use that to purchase food to sustain themselves. We think that kind of approach with consumer empowerment and choice, and giving a SNAP-like card, a debit card to households to use to choose between providers for internet connectivity, makes sense, and that should be appropriated by Congress, given the importance that it has relative to students being connected to teachers, workers being connected to employment, families being connected to one another, patients being connected to doctors and healthcare. And we'd like to see that reform take place in the next Congress. We think there's an opportunity for that.
So let me follow up then. I think, looking at policy projections, various pundits are talking about what the next administration might put on the top of its list for tech and telecoms. And digital platforms is one, but I guess that'll be discussed in the next session. However, I think it's fair game to talk about that. It's the funding aspect, but beyond that as well, obviously, lots of issues there. but also the hotspots of net neutrality and privacy. Those three things seem to be the hot buttons. How do you see things playing out over the next 4 years? And if you had a chance to make your case now about how things should play out, how would you set the stage?
Well, we've been talking about this quite a bit, Ann, and like I said, what we've seen in terms of private investment of trillions of dollars in the networks that served the U.S. and the EU and Asia and everywhere else across the globe very, very well in helping to respond to this pandemic. The networks held up. We saw a 27% increase in demand and utilization of our broadband networks in the midst of this pandemic, and yet there was no slowing. There was no problem in terms of people being able to get online and to connect and to stream and to upload and download. And that's a testament to the resiliency of the networks. We're very proud of that. We want to continue to invest to connect with those unserved areas, to Chairman Pai's point as well, to build out the infrastructure and to make it more affordable to others. But if you have a regulatory regime that hinders the ability for companies like AT&T to invest in those networks, I think you're going to slow the ability to get people connected. And that's the exact opposite of what's clearly needed right now. If you look actually in terms of the question or the concern about discrimination, throttling, and that kind of business activity, we of course reject that. We would not engage in that. But we now know for a fact that's not what happened in the midst of an incredible surge in demand. Now, there are parts of the internet ecosystem where there is throttling, where there is discrimination. It's not from the providers, from the investors in the networks themselves and ISPs like AT&T and our competitors. There is a need, we believe, for increased transparency and regulation in the internet ecosystem in a way where those big tech platform companies, which are really the companies that have the market power right now in the internet ecosystem, should be subject to kind of transparency and oversight in the same way the network providers are currently, but they're not. And so in terms of a light touch regulatory approach that fosters and incentivizes private sector investment, we obviously think that's the most productive for the American public and for all across the globe, and is the most beneficial to consumers. We don't doubt or deny or object to the notion that we should be subject to regulation. It's important that regulation be smart and rational and light touch in nature if we're going to continue to have the benefit of the investment that we've seen through the pandemic in networks that allow people to connect.
Yeah, I think Ed makes a number of very good points, and I would simply piggyback off them to say that with respect to the pandemic in particular, I would argue that the most critical decisions we made with respect to broadband connectivity were made before anyone ever heard of COVID-19. The light touch approach we began in 2017 that has persisted ever since enabled companies to make the difficult decisions to raise capital, hire work crews, and build high-class, resilient networks that were able to withstand the increase in usage that we saw starting in March here in the United States. There was a lot of skepticism. Would these networks be able to sustain the increase in traffic? And not only did they do so, but actually fixed broadband speeds in the United States increased by 10% over the pandemic from February until August, and mobile speeds increased by 4%. Now, contrast with that with other parts of the world, where, for example, in Europe, we heard reports that the European Union had to ask providers like YouTube and Netflix to throttle content from HD to SD because they were not confident that the infrastructure would withstand the increase in traffic. And so to me, at least, it is easy to say that utility-style regulation should be the norm. After all, broadband is very important, and it's always seductive to suggest that we should subject it then to a utility-style regulation. But the consequences of that are ultimately worse for consumers. And so I would argue that the bipartisan market-based framework that we restored in 2017, one which served the United States well from 1996 until 2015, is ultimately the right one. And every single day we see the proof of that with not just the companies like AT&T that are building and upgrading networks, but the new competitors in the market. I mean, there are companies now entering this space that many people never even heard of back in 2017. Low Earth orbit satellite companies like SpaceX and OneWeb that are looking to deploy hundreds of networks, hundreds of satellites in the low Earth orbit. Fixed wireless companies that can leverage the 6 gigahertz band, which we recently freed up for unlicensed use to provide more competition in urban and in rural areas. We see electric utilities entering the marketplace as well to create broadband. So my argument is the best way to attack the problems that net neutrality advocates claim they want to solve is not through heavy-handed regulation driven by Washington, but through competition and a market-based framework that ensures that consumers are protected, but also preserves the strong incentive to invest and to innovate in networks.
I guess two of the topics that we haven't really touched on are privacy and security, flip sides of the same coin in some respects. Obviously, right now in the United States, it's a bit Wild West on the telecoms front and at the federal level in terms of, except in particular sectors, but certainly not the telecom sector, except in a limited way. And then on the security side, obviously, the pandemic has just highlighted how important cybersecurity is. And obviously, there are lots of issues around that in terms of, who the equipment suppliers are and so forth. Maybe you could each talk a little bit about those two very important issues that are adjacent to, but really becoming front and center in all of the, telecoms and tech areas.
I mean, I'd be happy to tackle the security piece at least. And I would argue here that it's not just enough for our networks to be strong, they also have to be secure. And this FCC has recognized that. For example, we've talked about the Universal Service Fund. This FCC was the first to prohibit monies from that fund from being used by telecom carriers on equipment or services that have been deemed to present a national security threat to the United States. That's prospective. Retrospectively, we've also started an inventory to figure out which carriers and where have incorporated that unsecure network equipment in their networks. And we've also called upon Congress to fund the estimated $1.6 billion it will take for those carriers, disproportionately small rural carriers, to extract those security problematic equipment from their networks. We've also worked very collaboratively with other countries and agencies to make sure that we're on the same page. For example, here in the United States, we cooperate very closely with CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security, and with other agencies within the National Security and Intelligence Community framework to make sure that we're speaking with one voice. I also personally have been involved, probably more than any FCC chairman in recent history, in working with foreign counterparts on these very same issues. I've personally been to everywhere from Bahrain to Malaysia. I've spoken to my counterparts in Brazil and Israel. I was a member of the delegation to the Prague conference last year, and then again virtually this year, where 32 governments came together to upgrade the so-called Prague proposals, a shared framework for cybersecurity. So here I think it's increasingly obvious that our networks do not necessarily limit themselves to national borders. We need to make sure we're all on the same page. And I'm very proud of the steps that we've taken at the FCC to promote the security of our networks. I would certainly defer to Ed on the privacy piece. Obviously, privacy is an issue that has generated a lot of discussion with California adopting its own scheme, with GDPR, of course, as an overlay here in the United States and around the world. I know Congress has been discussing this issue for a couple of years, and I'm not sure where that will go in the time to come, but it'll be interesting to see, and hopefully will provide some certainty to all involved, both companies and consumers.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ajit. And you're right. For us, and your point, security and privacy are intertwined. They're the two sides of the same coin. And obviously, for our customers, their privacy is critically important that we protect that. And also, clearly, for us as a company, that our networks be secure is a top priority. We spend billions and billions of dollars ensuring that, and hire people who are very good at it and the best in the business to ensure it as well. And that's going to be critically important going forward. We've seen estimates that mobile networks, the video traffic is going to grow by around 30% over the next 4 years. And the Internet of Things, to the point that Chairman Pai just made, is going to become more and more have a lot more data out there that's going to be subject to risk. And it's got to be protected. One of the things that we've done as a company is to lead an organization, the Open Radio Access Network. It's about a consortium of over 150 companies, and we're trying to enable an intelligent and open ecosystem that ensures security in the supply chain, which is critically important both in the U.S. and internationally. And so one of the things that we're doing is having this public-private partnership with governments to make sure that we've got models in place relative to what's necessary to meet the demands for cybersecurity in the supply chain and in the practices that we implement. And we've got a lot of people working in key bodies across the globe, like the Third Generation Partnership Project, to try to get consistent approaches here and interoperability, and we think that will help to ensure going forward that people do have a secure internet. Privacy, to the chairman's point, California just enacted a very stringent privacy policy. It's going to be implemented. It was a referendum, a ballot initiative, and now it's got to be translated into enforcement. And we're watching that very closely, and we'll comply, of course, as will everyone. Given the size of California, and to Ajit's point, the internet doesn't have geographic boundaries. That's likely going to become, in some ways, a de facto national policy. We think a national policy, a uniform policy, would be helpful, and have advocated for some time that Congress, implement a national policy rather than trying to, because of the lack of geographic boundaries, the complications of trying to adapt to 50 different state regulations on privacy would be a challenge, and you'd end up defaulting to the lowest common denominator, to my point. But we believe it's in the interest of consumers and our customers and people all across the globe that their privacy be protected.
And I guess just to follow up on that, Ed, from the European perspective, obviously the Court of Justice of the European Union has concluded that the U.S. is not adequate for reasons that go well beyond data protection laws. It's more about surveillance and so forth. Are there any solutions that you see in sight to this challenge that we face in terms of transatlantic data flows? Because obviously, without you guys being named, telecoms operators were in the frame of that decision.
Yeah, well, obviously those data flows are critically important to fostering economic growth and growth of the internet and of that connectivity that we've been discussing. I would say this, Ann. I mean, I think if you look at the referendum passed in California, it feels pretty resonant of the GDPR in Europe, and I suspect as it's implemented, those gaps will get narrowed considerably over time.
Great. Now, our system is supposed to be showing us questions, but I cannot see the questions. But I do have one that came through on my mobile from the organizers for Chairman Pai. So
Okay.
if you don't mind, Chairman Pai, I'll relay this in the old-fashioned way.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Hey,
so,
it beats a congressional hearing.
Right. Well, so this is following up on the brief net neutrality comments that you made. And just wondering what your prediction is for how it will pan out between now and 2025. What will the world look like in 2025?
That's a good question. So certainly there's been a lot of speculation about that. I mean, look, on the other side, there's clearly a religious attachment to this issue. There clearly doesn't need to be a market failure. There doesn't need to be evidence that there's a need for this type of utility scale regulation. And even the experience of the last almost 3 years, and we made our initial decision in December 14th of 2017. Even the experience of the last 3 years, which has been largely, if not exclusively positive, is not enough to convince some that there isn't a problem here to be solved. And so, it's up obviously to the next administration to make that determination. But I would argue again that the market-based framework has been proven to be the right one. And I think it's very easy now to look back and say, America's internet economy was simply destined to be. But that's not the case. It took the courage of one of my predecessors, Bill Kennard, at the dawn of the commercial internet to make the decision. And I would highly commend to anyone who's interested to go back and look at the speech he gave. I think it was in 1997 or maybe 1999, I can't remember which, where he talked about this. And what he explicitly said was that he did not want to subject this new dynamic technology known as the internet to the heavy-handed regulations of Title II. He didn't want to dump, I think he said something almost verbatim, as we didn't want to dump the Title II regulations on this new pipe. And because he recognized that over time, millions more Americans were going to need to access the internet, and many more services were going to be delivered over the internet was going to scale in a way that was dissimilar from other types of utilities, like water and electricity and the like. We don't use 10x water and electricity year over year as we do internet traffic, for example. And so in order to encourage the type of infrastructure investment that was necessary in order to keep up with that consumer demand, he made the determination that Title I was the way to go. And that was a determination that served us, as I said, incredibly well from 1996 until 2015. $1.5 trillion in network investment, companies like Facebook and Google and Netflix becoming global powerhouses, and consumers benefiting from all of that innovation. So to me, at least going forward, the question is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? If the problem is blocking of content, throttling of content, anti-competitive paid prioritization, transparency, I've just described in 10 seconds legislation that Congress should be able to pass by 99% support very easily. But this has become much more of a political issue, and it's sort of bizarre that people have focused so much on this to the exclusion of all of these other priorities at the FCC, at least, that I would think consumers, I know the consumers are much more worried about is, how do I get access? How to get more affordable access? How do I make sure that my kids have advanced technologies just like everybody else? And those are the types of things we should be focused on, not on this maniacal focus on utility-style regulation that just simply doesn't work. And so, again, the proof is in the pudding. With speeds doubling over the last 3 years, more than doubling at this point, with millions more Americans having access to the internet, with us setting fiber deployment records, small cells going up, the internet economy now is stronger than ever. And so it's sort of strange to see this impulse in some quarters to ping pong back and forth at the FCC. I hope Congress simply sits with a bipartisan voice and speaks once and for all on this issue, so we can move to things that consumers are genuinely concerned about.
Well, and if I might add, that would be incredibly helpful to companies like ours in terms of having, as you know, in terms of making investment decisions. One of the greatest things that's a hindrance, in addition to onerous regulation, which makes it harder to invest. Uncertainty is problematic, for a company like ours in terms of making decisions and others, and volatility and regulation swings back and forth. To Ajit's point, Congress should act on this. We should have a statutory approach here, not a regulatory swing between different administrations and this thing getting slapped around like a hockey puck. We've advocated for that, and the concerns that Ajit mentioned relative to protecting the consumers, they can be addressed in a way with a light regulatory touch that ensures that consumers are protected. We're fully supportive of that. And that would be the proper way to do it, would be for Congress to act and not for this to become a source of uncertainty for companies like ours in investing decisions.
Well, we seem to have a very shy audience this morning, so I will ask another question. If anybody does have questions, though, please send them through, and somehow or other they'll make their way to us. In terms of the auction process and the many that have been going on, and quite successfully in the United States, I think that's one of the areas where your leadership, Chairman Pai, has been really commendable and well recognized. Any suggestions, whether from your perspective and also from AT&T's as sort of one of the users of that system, for countries around the world about how they can learn from the experiences here in terms of how to free up spectrum?
That's a good question. So from the FCC perspective, I think my overriding suggestion would be to have courage, to be bold, to take on these fights. It would be very easy in every one of these bands where there are incumbencies, either other government agencies or private incumbents, to simply say, okay, we're not going to focus on that band. But once you start to do that, you quickly realize that virtually every band is going to be brownfield, that there's going to be some incumbent that's going to object. And so I think the hallmark over the last 4 years has been that the FCC has not been willing to shy away from the fight, that we are going to take on these big issues and make the tough decisions that are necessary in order to promote American leadership in 5G. For example, in the C-band auction, which was the big auction starting off in about an hour or so, actually less than an hour, I believe it is. We had a lot of objections. We had the foreign satellite companies saying, no, you can't do this. We had Congress saying you shouldn't act at all until legislation is passed. We had folks at the FCC saying that we don't have the legal authority to do this and opposing us every step of the way. But we made the determination, no, we're going to align everybody's interests to promote 5G. We offered accelerated relocation payments to C-band satellite operators, which they accepted. So they were on the same page in terms of clearing the spectrum quickly. We believed we had the legal authority to move ahead, and we did so. And in fact, in the last 5 minutes, I found out that the FCC won its case in the DC circuit, essentially affirming our authority to hold that C-band auction. So I'm glad we moved ahead. And similarly, if we had waited for Congress to legislate on this issue, we'd still be in the starting blocks because Congress hasn't done anything on this topic, despite over a year of talking about it. So I think from the C-band to the 5.9 gigahertz band to the 6 gigahertz band to 3.5, you're always going to find these different, in whatever country it is, whatever band we're talking about, you'll always find somebody raising their hand and saying, well, we're all in favor of 5G, but just not in this band. And I think the critical thing for regulators to keep in mind is you're never going to put points on the board if you never step on the field. Have the courage to take on some of these difficult issues and figure out a way to maximize the public interest in these public airwaves. It could be a sharing protocol where the incumbent gets to remain in the band, but you share that spectrum with the new entrants. It could be a clearing protocol where you can relocate the incumbents or give them alternative technologies to do what they do and free up the band for new uses. It could be unlicensed, where you're opening up a band for Wi-Fi and other advanced technologies. But whatever it is, consumers will never benefit from your decisions if you don't make a decision. So it hasn't been easy, I will say, as Ed, I'm sure probably knows. But nonetheless, we've put the building blocks in place for companies like his and many others to really deliver incredible wireless services, the likes of which we can't even conceive today in many cases.
And I just echo what you said. Freeing up new spectrum to be utilized for a new generation of 5G wireless services has been a hallmark of Chairman Pai's tenure at the FCC, and it's had a huge impact on the U.S.'s ability and private companies' ability to really put in place what's going to be a significant improvement in people's lives with the development of this 5G network. And I would also say, just to your point about the model and the approach, it has served to foster private sector investment and build out. The chairman's right in terms of spectrum sharing, geographic, and other means by which we can do that. There are developments there. The one thing that would be a mistake, and Chairman Pai has been very strong in making the intellectual point about this as well, is to nationalize the networks and to nationalize the 5G, the management of it from a government-run perspective. That would be a huge hindrance, and taking chances on risky, unproven wholesale models that would likely not result in the deployment of the spectrum and getting it out to consumers. That would be a significant step back and a reversal in progress toward getting the 5G network that we need implemented.
And if I could add to that too, Ed captured that issue exceptionally well. I probably can't improve upon it, but I think the history of the wireless marketplace in the United States demonstrates that the market, not the government, is best positioned to deliver value to the American consumer. It might be seductive to suggest that government should be the one picking winners and losers and either nationalizing 5G or creating some sort of government overseen wholesale network. But over time, that's going to disincentivize investment and innovation. And once that happens, that is essentially the death of the wireless marketplace in the long run, and I would argue even in the short run.
Exactly.
So maybe to wrap up with one last question, because we're running out of time. maybe I could just ask, we've been talking a lot about 5G. We've been talking about, many of the great things that have been happening despite the pandemic or maybe because of it. Crystal ball, what are going to be the hot, apps and, other services that we're going to see with 5G that we don't have now over the next decade?
I mean, Ed's actually involved in delivering those, so he should probably first. I would think I'm just a armchair enthusiast.
For now.
That's right.
Well, I would say one thing, and I don't know about hot apps and what's coming in that regard. I do think what we've seen relative to, and obviously our company with Warner Media, very directly involved in over-the-top services, and again, consumers having the power and the ability to choose what is to their liking and avail themselves of that. And I think you're going to continue to see that grow. And I think the policies that foster that are important to get in place. That includes, when you look at the economic impact of our production, which of course has been chilled by the pandemic as well in terms of our content creativity pipeline. But we'll be able to get back to that, and we have to a certain extent soon. But all across the globe, if you look at the impact, for example, Game of Thrones, is based in Northern Ireland, but also frequently filmed in Croatia and Spain. Chernobyl was largely filmed in Lithuania. I mean, the impact across the globe of this content production that's a result of the demand by consumers that's more customizable. And over the top, I think is going to be significant and will kind of transform how we get our entertainment. I would also say education and healthcare. We talked about healthcare. We touched on that. The impact that's going to have and the improvement in the quality of life for people, as for the ability to visit a doctor and have real-time monitoring. For example, because of the Internet of Things, being able to have doctors monitor patients not in a hospital room, but in their own bedroom. Things like that are going to be significant. And then, it seems to me that higher education in particular is, open to some disruption, and that is an area where I think we're going to see, and the effects of the pandemic have probably expedited the extent to which higher education in particular, but all education, K-12 also, is going to be affected in a positive way for students and consumers.
And maybe, go ahead, Chairman Pai, but one last question to sort of follow on to that. Do you think the FCC and other telecoms regulators around the world have sufficient powers to regulate what they need to regulate in this evolving world, maybe as a follow-on to what Ed has said?
That's a great question. So I would answer, in the United States at least, no. As most people probably know, the FCC only has jurisdiction over commercial spectrum. Spectrum that is used by the federal government is controlled through the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And by many estimates, the federal government holds, or at least has some equities, over a good chunk of the spectrum that is usable for wireless communications. And so many have suggested the time has come for the FCC to have unified authority over all of the airwaves, to be able to balance between the federal and non-federal uses in a much more agile way, as opposed to this sort of back and forth between the private and public uses. And look, I truly believe in the professionalism of the FCC staff, in particular the technical strength of its Office of Engineering and Technology, as well as all the commissioners over time to make decisions based on what is the right thing to do. And so I would hope that many would embrace a more forward-thinking vision of what the FCC's power over spectrum should be, because those airwaves are only going to become more critical, and the disputes over those airwaves are only going to become more keen as time goes on. I would also argue, with respect to Ed's previous point, that we also need to break down some of the other barriers that might not necessarily be within the FCC's bailiwick, but nonetheless might stand in the way of consumer value. So, for example, when it comes to telehealth, I've been very, very outspoken about the importance of telehealth for American people. I grew up in a rural area, the son of physicians, so I know how critical it is in rural areas in particular. But there's still some legacy regulations that stand in the way, even if you have the best-in-class broadband. So, for example, state by state, you have to be licensed if you're a medical professional in order to provide medical care across state lines. In a telehealth environment, that might be very difficult. Same thing with reimbursement for some of the medical health services that are delivered over a broadband connection. And so I think sort of a holistic look at how the FCC and other agencies can work together to maximize the power of broadband delivered services and applications would go a long way, I think, in enhancing the value that we're able to deliver. Perhaps there are others around the globe that are facing the same challenges, and if so, I certainly can speak for myself and hopefully for the future FCC too, that we stand ready and willing to be a partner with you. We're all in it together, and the best practices can be found in any part of the globe, and we want to incorporate and learn from that as best we can.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. That'll have to be the last word. We're going to now move to Narita O'Loughlin, Chair and Head of the Australian Communications and Media Authority. Thanks to both Ed and Chairman Pai for the excellent interventions that you've made today.
Thank you
so much.